You are standing in the middle of a marketplace in ancient Memphis, roughly 1350 BCE. The air smells like wet grain, animal dung, and something faintly sweet, fermented, yeasty, alive. Around you, workers are passing clay jars between their hands. They drink from them in long, steady pulls. Children drink from them. Priests drink from them. The woman selling linen bolts takes a sip between customers. Everyone here is drinking beer. All day. Every day, the popular belief is completely understandable. Ancient Egyptians drank beer constantly. We know this. The archaeological record is airtight. Beer appears in tomb paintings, in administrative records, in workers' wage documents. The laborers who built the pyramids at Giza received rations of up to 4 or 5 liters of beer per day as part of their compensation. That is not a typo. 4 to 5 liters. Per person, per day. So the logical conclusion seems obvious. Ancient Egyptians must have been perpetually, chronically drunk. Their entire civilization, apparently, was operating somewhere between mildly buzzed and completely hammered. But here is one thing that does not quite add up. Those pyramid workers, the ones drinking 4 liters of beer a day, they were also moving 2.5-ton limestone blocks up an incline using nothing but rope, wooden sledges, and raw human muscle. So the question worth asking is, how drunk were they actually? To understand what was actually in those jars, you need to understand what ancient Egypt actually was. We are talking about the Nile Valley between roughly 3100 and 332 BCE, a narrow ribbon of irrigated green cut through absolute desert, wedged between the eastern and western ergs of the Sahara. The climate was hot, reliably brutal, and dry outside the flood season. The staple foods were emmer wheat bread and barley beer, supplemented by river fish, Nile perch, tilapia, catfish pulled from murky brown water, alongside onions, leeks, figs, and lentils cooked in clay pots over dung fires. Meat, mostly duck and goose, was a luxury for the wealthy and the temple-fed. The beer itself, they called it henqet, was not brewed the way we think of brewing. There were no hops, no controlled fermentation chambers, no precision yeast cultures. Workers made it by partially baking dense loaves of emmer barley bread, crumbling those loaves into large pottery vessels filled with water, and letting the whole mixture sit in the heat until natural wild yeasts present in the grain, and the air began to ferment the sugars. The resulting liquid was thick, nutritious, full of B vitamins, calories, and wild microbial activity. It was closer in texture and character to a liquid bread than to anything you would recognize as beer today. Hold on. The fermentation process in ancient Egyptian beer was not just incomplete, it was deliberately incomplete. Modern analyses of residue inside ancient Egyptian brewing vessels, conducted by researchers including Delwen Samuel at the McDonald Institute for Archaeological Research in Cambridge, confirmed that the fermentation in henqet was inconsistent, partial, and variable. Some vessels showed higher alcohol content, others barely registered. The average alcohol by volume across reconstructed samples consistently came in somewhere between 1 and 2%. Some batches approached 3% under optimal conditions. The Budweiser you buy at a gas station is 5%. The IPA in your fridge is probably 6 or 7. Let that actually sink in. The 4 to 5 litre daily beer ration that sounds like a frat party was, in terms of actual alcohol delivered to the human bloodstream, roughly equivalent to drinking 2 cans of light beer spread across an 8-hour workday, which is not nothing, but it is also not what anyone pictures when they imagine ancient Egyptians stumbling around the pyramid construction site. The reason for this goes deeper than just primitive brewing technique. The human body is not a simple machine. It is more like an extremely cautious accountant. It tracks every input, adjusts every output, and it does not particularly care about your assumptions. When alcohol enters the bloodstream at low, consistent doses over a long period of time, the liver upregulates the enzymes it uses to process ethanol. The body becomes more efficient at metabolizing it. Tolerance builds not just behaviorally, as we usually think of it, but enzymatically at the cellular level. A person who has been consuming 1 to 2% fermented grain liquid every day since childhood, as Egyptians did, because it was safer than raw Nile water, is not the same physiological system as a person who drinks beer occasionally. The body adapts. This is called metabolic tolerance, and it is a documented and well-characterized phenomenon in alcohol pharmacology research, the clearest modern case study for what happens when a population experiences a sudden, dramatic shift in alcohol exposure is the experience of indigenous peoples of North America following European colonization. This is not a comfortable history, but it is a precise one. Before contact, most indigenous North American populations had minimal or no exposure to distilled or high percentage alcohol, not due to some genetic moral failing, but simply because the fermentation technology and the cultural infrastructure around it had not developed in the same way. Their bodies had not spent generations building the enzymatic and metabolic baseline that European populations had developed through centuries of wine, ale, and spirits consumption. When European colonizers introduced high percentage spirits, often deliberately, as part of trade policy, the physiological impact on communities with no metabolic history of high-dose alcohol exposure was severe and rapid. Rates of alcohol-related illness, dependency, and death rose sharply within one generation, an evolutionary instant. The control group exists in the historical record. Indigenous populations in regions where contact occurred later, or where access to high percentage alcohol was more restricted, showed measurably different trajectories in the early contact period. Same genetic population. Different exposure history, profoundly different outcomes. Same software, different inputs, completely different output. Here is the strongest argument against everything I just said. Maybe the alcohol content analysis is flawed. After all, we are working from residue in ancient pottery, not from sealed bottles with original contents intact. The chemical fingerprint of fermentation can degrade over 3,000 years. And beyond the analytical uncertainty, there is another objection worth taking seriously: the textual record. Egyptian medical papyri, including the Ebers papyrus and the Edwin Smith papyrus, do reference wine and beer in ways that suggest medicinal and ritual effects that go beyond simple hydration. Egyptian festivals, the festival of drunkenness associated with the goddess Hathor, for example, explicitly celebrated altered states of consciousness. If everyone was just drinking liquid bread at 1% alcohol, what exactly were they celebrating? Partly, yes, this part is real. There is solid textual evidence for intentional intoxication in specific religious and festival contexts in ancient Egypt. The festival of drunkenness was a real event, documented in temple inscriptions at Dendera and Karnak, in which the ritual goal was explicitly altered consciousness, achieved through higher strength date wine and special fermented preparations kept separate from the everyday henqet ration. The existence of special occasion high alcohol drinks does not contradict the low alcohol daily ration. They were categorically different products for categorically different purposes. The everyday beer was nutritional infrastructure. The festival drink was a deliberate departure from it, which is precisely why it was significant enough to build a religious festival around. The missing piece is simply this: The Egyptians themselves distinguished between their daily henqet and their ceremonial wine. We collapsed that distinction by reading the word beer and projecting modern assumptions onto it. So the question becomes, what were ancient Egyptians actually experiencing every single day when they drank? Ancient Egyptians could get drunk. The answer is yes, clearly, and the archaeological and textual evidence makes that unambiguous. In everyday life, the daily labor ration, the family meal, the child's cup, the answer is that they were consuming a low-alcohol, nutrient-dense fermented grain beverage that delivered somewhere between minimal and moderate alcohol exposure to bodies that had built substantial metabolic tolerance to it over lifetimes and generations. Because daily henqet at 1 to 2% ABV, consumed in a heat-adapted body with high caloric demands and a lifetime of enzymatic conditioning, produced something much closer to hydration than intoxication. In ceremonial contexts, the Hathor festivals, the elite wine culture documented in New Kingdom tomb paintings, the answer becomes different. Because the drink was different, the body's prepared tolerance was the same, but the dose was not. The conditions required for the opposite outcome to be true are precisely the conditions that the Egyptians themselves deliberately engineered for specific occasions and kept entirely separate from their daily life. Here is what all of this actually means. Every time you look at a craft beer menu and feel slightly intimidated by the 11% double IPA, and you think that choosing the session ale makes you somehow less serious, that is not personal weakness. That is your body accurately computing input against output the way it has always done. Every time you eat half a loaf of sourdough before dinner and cannot figure out why it did not fill you up the way you expected it to, that is the same system that made fermented grain the nutritional backbone of an entire civilization for 3,000 years. It was designed to keep you wanting more, because wanting more kept people alive in environments where caloric surplus was survival. And every time you have been to a party where someone insists that their ancestors could simply drink more, handle more, were built differently, you now know exactly how to answer that. They were built the same. The environment was different. Your liver is